Chapter 21 of The Gold Hunters by J. D. Borthwick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Chapter 21 In Lighter Mood. If one can imagine the booths and penny theaters on a race course, left for a year or two till they are tattered and torn and blackened with the weather, he will have some idea of the appearance of San Andres. It was certainly the most out at elbows and disorderly looking camp I had yet seen in the country. The only wooden house was the San Andres Hotel, and here I took up my quarters. It was kept by a Missourian doctor, and being the only establishment of the kind in the place, was quite full. We sat down 40 or 50 at the table d'hote. The Mexicans formed by far the most numerous part of the population. The streets, for there were two streets at right angles to each other, and the gambling rooms were crowded with them, loafing about in their blankets, doing nothing. There were 3 gambling rooms in the village, all within a few steps of each other, and in each of them was a Mexican band, playing guitars, harps, and flutes. Of course, one heard them all 3 at once, and as each played a different tune, the effect, as may be supposed, was very pleasing. The sleeping apartments in the hotel itself were all full, and I had to take a cot in a tent on the other side of the street, which was a sort of colony of the parent establishment. It was situated between 2 gambling houses, one of which was kept by a Frenchman, who, whenever his musicians stopped to take breath or brandy, began a series of doleful airs on an old barrel organ. Till how late in the morning they kept it up I cannot say, but whenever I happened to awake in the middle of the night, my ears were still greeted by these sweet sounds. There was one canvas structure, differing but little in appearance from the rest, excepting that a small wooden cross surmounted the roof over the door. This was a Roman Catholic church. The only fitting up of any kind in the interior was the altar, which occupied the further end from the door, and was decorated with as much display as circumstances admitted, being draped with the commonest kind of colored cotton cloths, and covered with candlesticks, some brass, some of wood, but most of them regular California candlesticks, old claret and champagne bottles, arranged with due regard to the numbers and grouping of those bearing the different ornamental labels of St. Julian, Medoc, and other favorite brands. I went in on Sunday morning while service was going on, and found a number of Mexican women occupying the space nearest the altar, the rest of the church being filled with Mexicans, who all maintained an appearance of respectful devotion. 2 or 3 Americans, who were present out of curiosity, naturally kept in the background near the door, excepting 2 great hulking fellows, who came swaggering in and jostled their way through the crowd of Mexicans, making it evident from their demeanor that their only object was to show their supreme contempt for the congregation and for the whole proceedings. Presently, however, the entire congregation went down on their knees, leaving these 2 awkward louts standing in the middle of the church, as sheepish looking a pair of asses as one could wish to see. They were hemmed in by the crowd of kneeling Mexicans. There was no retreat for them, and it was extremely gratifying to see how quickly their bullying impudence was taken out of them, and that it brought upon them a punishment which they evidently felt so acutely. The officiating priest, who was a Frenchman, afterwards gave a short sermon in Spanish, which was listened to attentively, and the people then dispersed to spend the remainder of the day in the gambling rooms. The same afternoon a drove of wild California cattle passed through the camp, and as several head were being drafted out, I had an opportunity of witnessing a specimen of the extraordinary skill of the Mexican in throwing the lasso. Galloping in among the herd, and swinging the riata over his head, he singles out the animal he wishes to secure, and, seldom missing aim, he throws his lasso so as to encircle its horns. As soon as he sees that he has accomplished this, he immediately wheels round his horse, who equally well understands his part of the business, and stands prepared to receive the shock when the bull shall have reached the length of the rope. In his endeavors to escape, the bull then gallops round in a circle, of which the center is the horse, moving slowly round and leaning over with one of his 4 feet planted well out, so as to enable him to hold his own in the struggle. An animal, if he is not very wild, may be taken along in this way, but generally another man rides up behind him and throws his lasso so as to catch him by the hind leg. This requires great dexterity and precision, as the lasso has to be thrown in such a way that the bull shall put his foot into the noose before it reaches the ground. Having an animal secured by the horns and a hind foot, they have him completely under command. One man drags him along by the horns, while the other steers him by the hind leg. If he gets at all obstreperous, however, they throw him and drag him along the ground. The lasso is about 20 yards long, made of strips of rawhide plaited, and the end is made fast to the high horn which sticks up in front of the Mexican saddle. The strain is all upon the saddle, and the girth, which is consequently immensely strong and lashed up very tight. The Mexican saddles are well adapted for this sort of work, and the Mexicans are unquestionably splendid horsemen, though they ride too long for English ideas, the knee being hardly bent at all. 2 of the Vigilance Committee rode over from Mokelumne Hill next morning to get the padre to return with them to confess a Mexican whom they were going to hang that afternoon for having cut into a tent and stolen several $100. I unfortunately did not know anything about it till it was so late that had I gone there I should not have been in time to see the execution. Not that I cared for the mere spectacle of a poor wretch hanging by the neck, but I was extremely desirous of witnessing the ceremonies of an execution by Judge Lynch, and though I was 2 or 3 years cruising about in the mines, I never had the luck to be present on such an occasion. I particularly regretted having missed this one, as from the accounts I afterwards heard of it, it must have been well worth seeing. The Mexican was at first suspected of the robbery from his own folly in going the very next morning to several stores and spending an unusual amount of money on clothes, revolvers, and so on. When once suspected, he was seized without ceremony, and on his person was found a quantity of gold specimens and coin, along with the purse itself, all of which were identified by the man who had been robbed. With such evidence, of course, he was very soon convicted and was sentenced to be hung. On being told of the decision of the jury, and that he was to be hung the next day, he received the information as a piece of news which no way concerned him, merely shrugging his shoulders and saying "Sta bueno" in a tone of utter indifference in which the Mexicans generally use the expression, requesting at the same time that the priest might be sent for. When he was led out to be hanged, he walked along with as much nonchalance as any of the crowd, and when told at the place of execution that he might say whatever he had to say, he gracefully took off his hat, and blowing a farewell whiff of smoke through his nostrils, he threw away the cigarita he had been smoking, and addressing the crowd, he asked forgiveness for the numerous acts of villainy to which he had already confessed, and politely took leave of the world with "Adios, caballeros." He was then run up to a butcher's derrick by the Vigilance Committee, all the members having hold of the rope, and thus sharing the responsibility of the act. A very few days after I left San Andres, a man was lynched for a robbery committed very much in the same manner. But if stringent measures were wanted in one part of the country more than another, it was in such flimsy canvas towns as these two places, where there was such a population of worthless Mexican canaille, who were too lazy to work for an honest livelihood. I went on in a few days to Angel's Camp, a village some miles further south, composed of well-built wooden houses, and altogether a more respectable and civilized-looking place than San Andres. The inhabitants were nearly all Americans, which no doubt accounted for the circumstance. While walking round the diggings in the afternoon, I came upon a Chinese camp in a gulch near the village. About 100 Chinamen had here pitched their tents on a rocky eminence by the side of their diggings. When I passed, they were at dinner or supper, and had all the curious little pots and pans and other fixins which I had seen in every Chinese camp, and were eating the same dubious-looking articles which excite in the mind of an outside barbarian a certain degree of curiosity to know what they are composed of, but not the slightest desire to gratify it by the sense of taste. I was very hospitably asked to partake of the good things, which I declined, but as I would not eat, they insisted on my drinking, and poured me out a pannikin full of brandy, which they seemed rather surprised I did not empty. They also gave me some of their cigaritas, the tobacco of which is aromatic and very pleasant to smoke, though wrapped up in too much paper. The Chinese invariably treated in the same hospitable manner anyone who visited their camps, and seemed rather pleased than otherwise at the interest and curiosity excited by their domestic arrangements. In the evening a ball took place at the hotel I was staying at, where, though none of the fair sex were present, dancing was kept up with great spirit for several hours. For music, the company were indebted to two amateurs, one of whom played the fiddle and the other the flute. It is customary in the mines for the fiddler to take the responsibility of keeping the dancers all right. He goes through the dance orally, and at the proper intervals his voice is heard above the music and the conversation, shouting loudly his directions to the dancers: "Ladies, chain, set to your partner," with other dancing school words of command, and after all the legitimate figures of the dance had been performed, out of the consideration for the thirsty appetites of the dancers and for the good of the house, he always announced in a louder voice than usual the supplementary finale of "Promenade to the bar and treat your partners." This injunction, as may be supposed, was most rigorously obeyed, and the "ladies," after their fatigues, tossed off their cocktails and lighted their pipes, just as in more polished circles they eat ice cream and sip lemonade. It was a strange sight to see a party of long bearded men in heavy boots and flannel shirts going through all the steps and figures of the dance with so much spirit, and often with a great deal of grace, hearty enjoyment depicted on their dried up, sunburned faces, and revolvers and bowie knives glancing in their belts, while a crowd of the same rough-looking customers stood around, cheering them on to greater efforts, and occasionally dancing a step or two quietly on their own account. Dancing parties such as these were very common, especially in small camps where there was no general resort to the gambling saloons of the larger towns. Whenever a fiddler could be found to play, a dance was got up. Waltzes and polkas were not so much in fashion as the lancers, which appeared to be very generally known, and besides gave plenty of exercise to the light fantastic toes of the dancers. For here men danced as they did everything else with all their might, and to go through the Lancers in such company was a very severe gymnastic exercise. The absence of ladies was a difficulty which was very easily overcome by a simple arrangement whereby it was understood that every gentleman who had a patch on a certain part of his inexpressibles should be considered a lady for the time being. These patches were rather fashionable, and were usually large squares of canvas showing brightly on a dark ground, so that the ladies of the party were as conspicuous as if they had been surrounded by the usual quantity of white muslin. A pas seul sometimes varied the entertainment. I was present on one occasion at a dance at Foster's Bar, when, after several sets of the Lancers had been danced, a young Scotch boy, who was probably a runaway apprentice from a Scotch ship, for the sailor boy air was easily seen through the thick coating of flour which he had acquired in his present occupation in the employment of a French baker, was requested to dance the Highland fling for the amusement of the company. The music was good, and he certainly did justice to it, dancing most vigorously for about a quarter of an hour, shouting and yelling as he was cheered by the crowd, and going into it with all the fury of a wild savage in a war dance. The spectators were uproarious in their applause. I dare say many of them never saw such an exhibition before. The youngster was looked upon as a perfect prodigy, and if he had drunk with all the men who then sought the honor of treating him, he would never have lived to tread another measure. Chapter 22.